He once tried to kill me. I saved him anyway. Tonight, they call him a hero for surviving the very system they blame me for creating. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Under the sharp glow of the CNN town hall lights, the stage was dressed in a quiet elegance designed to look unscripted. Everything, from the neutral blue backdrops to the staggered podiums, had been calibrated to simulate truth. This was not entertainment. The host had said this was a conversation America needed, yet the audience already knew what was coming. The topic wasn't new. A generation shift justice beyond the past. The real headline was the final guest. They introduced Jasmine Crockett first. The young congresswoman stepped forward in a dark power suit, her voice steady, her eyes sharper than the spotlight. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it was a signal, not of friendliness, but readiness. Next came Samara Hayes, former IC detainee, now a best-selling author and activist known for piercing takedowns of outdated institutions. And then came Arnold Schwarzenegger. He walked onto the stage slower than the rest. Not frail, measured. His black suit fit, without flash. He didn't nod to the applause. He simply took his place at the far end of the semicircle, eyes forward, hands folded, like a witness prepared to listen before speaking. A wooden box, roughly the size of a thick folder, sat quietly on the floor beside his chair. No one addressed it. No one asked. Jon Stewart opened the program with a practiced warmth that disguised precision. "We're here tonight," he began, not to pit generations against each other, but to examine whether some of the values we inherited are still worth passing down. Laughter flickered in polite waves across the audience. And who better to help us challenge those ideas? Jon continued, turning slightly toward Arnold, than the man whose career spans weightlifting, Hollywood, and governing a state larger than most countries, and whose policies, to be fair, sometimes age like expired protein powder. The laughter was louder this time. Arnold didn't react. Jon raised a brow. "No offense, Governor. We love a redemption arc." He looked at Jasmine. "Congresswoman, let's start with you. What does generational justice mean in 2025? Jasmine leaned forward without hesitation. "It means we stop pretending that experience is a free pass for immunity. It means we stop inviting symbols of power to moral conversations, as if they're not part of the reason we're still having them." She didn't look at Arnold when she said it. She didn't have to. Samara followed. "We live in a country where 16-year-olds were detained and deported under policies assigned by people we now celebrate. We glorify toughness. We forget consequences." Her voice didn't rise, but the sharpness in it could have cut through steel. Jon turned slightly to Arnold. "Governor, would you like to respond?" He didn't move. A full second passed. Then another. "No," Arnold said, simply. It wasn't a dodge. It was an anchor dropped mid-current. The silence that followed didn't feel awkward. It felt observed. Jon nodded, pivoting quickly. "All right. Samara, I believe you brought a case study that might help frame the debate." Samara reached beneath her chair and produced a manila folder. Inside was a photo, projected onto the screen behind them. A boy, 16, dark eyes, shaved head, looked straight at the lens without fear. His name appeared in bold letters. Diego Martinez. "He was deported from California in 2004, she said, under Governor Schwarzenegger's administration. His only crime was existing in the wrong zip code with the wrong papers. Today, Diego is a licensed trauma nurse. He saved 74 lives during the peak of COVID-19 in South Central." The room reacted. Murmurs turned into scattered claps. Jon gave a half grin. "Some stories write themselves." Jasmine added, "And yet we're still handing microphones to the people who try to erase those stories before they began." A pause. Arnold looked at the screen. Just once. No emotion showed, but his left hand gently adjusted the wooden box beside his chair, pulling it half an inch closer. Jon noticed. "Governor, any thoughts about Diego's case?" Another pause. Arnold looked at Jon. "Yes." The word landed like the opening of a sealed door, but he didn't continue. He let the weight of the words settle, like dust disturbed in an old room. Jon waited, But Arnold said nothing more. The moment stretched. Okay, John said, adjusting his cards. We'll come back to that. A camera panned wide. The audience looked confused, intrigued, perhaps irritated. Arnold's silence didn't register as refusal anymore. It registered as calculation. Backstage, a producer made a note. Samara, sensing momentum, stood. You want generational truth? She pointed at the screen again. Diego's one of thousands. He just survived long enough to prove he didn't deserve to be thrown away. Jasmine stepped in. That's the point. Not everyone gets to survive long enough. And with respect, Governor, your time for silence is past. Arnold's eyes shifted slightly. Still, he didn't speak. John leaned in, as if trying to poke the story into life. Governor, it's been 20 years. Don't you think Diego and others like him deserve at least a word of recognition? Arnold's voice came low, deliberate. I remember Diego. And then nothing. No follow-up. No defense. Just the echo of a name held like a stone in one hand. The audience sat straighter. The applause stopped trying to happen. The atmosphere shifted, not dramatic, not explosive, just heavier. Something had moved. But no one yet knew what. The audience hadn't heard those words yet. But something in the room had already shifted. It wasn't in the script, not in the cards Jon Stewart held, not in the run of show handed producers an hour before air. But it was present, in the way Arnold adjusted the wooden box by his chair, in the way his eyes followed Diego's photo on the screen, without flinching. The applause for Diego Martinez had not ended. In fact, it grew louder. On screen, his current photo appeared beside the one taken 2 decades ago. Same eyes, just older, steadier. A caption below, frontline nurse, advocate, survivor. Samara Hayes stood tall beside the image, her voice unwavering as she spoke. This is the story we don't tell enough, she said. This boy, now a man, was thrown out by a government that viewed him as disposable. Tonight, we honor what he rebuilt with nothing. John turned toward Arnold with a carefully measured tone. Governor, you signed the deportation orders that affected Diego directly. Would you like to speak to that now? Arnold didn't respond. Not right away. He looked at the screen. At Diego. Then he looked at the audience, letting the applause finish itself. No gesture to silence them. He simply waited until the room began to feel its own echo. John pressed gently, filling the space. You said earlier you remembered Diego. Could you tell us how? Arnold's voice, when it came, was low and steady. 2003, El Centro Detention Facility. There was a riot. Samara frowned slightly. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. John stayed quiet. I was there, Arnold continued, not as a politician. I went because I'd heard rumors of abuse inside. I didn't bring cameras. He paused, letting the statement settle. There were projectiles, fists, chaos, and one boy barely 16. He had a homemade weapon. I don't know if he meant to kill me, but the metal pipe he threw missed by this much. Arnold held 2 fingers less than an inch apart. No one else saw it. No camera caught it. But I did. The audience was no longer clapping. I could have had him arrested. Could have pressed charges. He would have disappeared into the system forever. Instead, I called my legal advisor. I asked him to bury the footage, to scrub the ID. He reached into the wooden box. Slowly. No urgency, no drama. What he pulled out was a sealed envelope, yellowing with age, tied in red string. This, Arnold said, is the original intake report. You'll see my name on the signature line. You'll notice something else. Under the deportation order, his name is missing. I replaced it with mine. John blinked. You what? Arnold looked at him. Not angry. Just steady. I erased him from the system. I took the blame for his incident. No one knew, not even Diego. Samara opened her mouth, then closed it again. Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper. Why? Arnold exhaled once, through his nose. Not frustration, restraint. Because he was a child, and I saw myself in him. He let the words hang in the air. John glanced at the audience. They were leaning forward. Phones had been lowered, eyebrows furrowed. Samara stepped forward. You're saying you carried the legal burden of an assault? Arnold nodded. And 20 years later, I watched him rise. I watched him save lives. I watched him be honored on this very network. And I said nothing. The silence became heavier than applause had ever been. Jasmine asked carefully, Did you ever think about telling him? No, why not? Arnold looked at her, and for a moment, it wasn't a former governor looking at a congresswoman. It was a man who had outlived a version of himself. Because the point wasn't that he owed me. Point was that someone had to believe he could be more than what the system told him he was. John stepped in, slower now. So why tell us tonight? Arnold's hand rested again on the wooden box. Because I came here expecting to be questioned. I didn't expect applause for the boy who nearly ended my life. And I want to see if any of you would ask, what cost me to stay silent? No one replied, because now they knew. And yet, something else was coming. The room didn't know it, but the man they thought they had cornered had just opened the first of two doors. He hadn't come to explain. He had come to reveal who had been watching whom. The envelope sat between them like confession no one had asked for, and no one could ignore. John Stewart's fingers tapped twice against his cue cards, then stopped. The screen behind him still showed Diego's face, framed by the bold words, from detained to decorated. No one had updated the caption. No one dared. Jasmine Crockett folded her arms, but the usual sharpness in her expression had softened. Just slightly, just enough for the cameras to catch. Samara Hayes, who had stood so confidently minutes ago, now stared at the report Arnold had placed on the table. Her lips parted, then sealed. Words didn't form as quickly anymore. John broke the silence with careful hands. Governor, if everything you're saying is true, then why now? Why reveal this story at all? Why not just let the myth live? Arnold didn't answer immediately. He took a breath, slow, like someone measuring the depth of water, before wading in. Because myths are dangerous, he said. They make us worship people for the wrong reasons, and crucify others before we understand what we're punishing them for. Samara leaned forward. Are you saying we shouldn't celebrate Diego? No, Arnold said calmly. I'm saying you shouldn't celebrate him by condemning me. His words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They arrived like a quiet storm, too soft to panic, too heavy to ignore. John glanced at the producers offstage. A countdown was flashing, for minutes to break. He ignored it. Let's go back, he said, steadying himself. Let's talk about policy. In 2004, as governor, you approved a budget plan that cut funding to the Children's Immigrant Relief Fund. That decision left thousands without legal representation. That's not a myth. That's on the record. Arnold nodded. It was, and you don't regret that? I regret that we couldn't protect everyone, Arnold said. But I don't regret telling the truth about what the system could and couldn't do. Jasmine spoke again, this time quieter. But you see why people like me, feel you abandoned us. You signed things that hurt people who looked like me, who lived where I lived. Arnold didn't look away. Yes, he said, I did. The air grew still again. But I also walked those streets. After the riots, after the fires, when the cameras were gone. I visited homes no politician would enter. I held the hands of mothers who'd lost their sons, not on the battlefield, but on sidewalks. I didn't do that for applause. John asked, Why did you? Arnold turned his head slowly toward the audience to see if I could still be useful without a microphone. That line didn't land like applause. It landed like memory. Everyone in the room had, at one point, wondered if their worth was tied to being seen. Samara spoke again, hesitant now. You came here knowing we'd attack you, that we'd bring up your past, that we'd celebrate someone who once tried to take your life. Why let that happen? Arnold looked at her, then back at the box. I wanted to see how you treat someone when you think they've lost everything. Jasmine asked, almost without meaning to, And what did we show you? Arnold didn't answer. John shifted his cards again. I'll be honest, Governor. This is the part where I'd normally pivot. Say something clever, throw to commercial, make everyone laugh again. But I don't know how to do that right now. No need, Arnold said. You already did what I came to see. The statement confused them. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a compliment. It was something else, a verdict without tone. Off camera, a producer gave the wrap up signal. John looked directly at Arnold. You said you came to watch, to remember, to stay silent. But you're not silent anymore. Arnold stood, slowly, deliberately, not to storm out, not to make a point, just to shift the room. I've said enough, he replied. Now you get to remember what you said. And just like that, he left the wooden box behind, still unopened, still sealed, still heavier than anyone knew. The screen faded to black, but the audience didn't move. Not yet, because something in the silence told them the show wasn't over. It had never really started. It had only ever been a test. No commercial aired. The break never came. The silence stretched longer than any segment ever allowed. Producers behind the glass stared at each other, unsure if they were still broadcasting or just bearing witness. Jon Stewart lowered his cards, rubbed his forehead, and exhaled like someone who just realized the conversation had outgrown the script. The wooden box remained on the table, sealed, untouched, heavier than when it arrived. No one asked what else was inside. Not yet. The screen behind the stage still showed Diego's face. But now, viewers at home saw it differently. His success hadn't changed. His story hadn't disappeared. But its foundation had cracked, not from scandal, not from shame, but from something more complicated. Mercy. Jasmine Crockett sat with her arms crossed again, not out of defiance this time, but because she suddenly didn't know where to place her hands. Her silence was no longer strategic. It was instinct. Samara looked down at her own notes, then closed the folder without reading. It didn't feel right anymore. The moral high ground had shifted beneath their feet, not because someone shouted, because someone didn't. John turned back to the audience. There's something I didn't expect to feel tonight, he said quietly. It's not guilt, it's disruption. Like we were so sure of the roles in this room, so sure who the villain was. And now, a voice in the front row interrupted, soft but firm. He changed the room without raising his voice. Everyone turned. The speaker was a man in his 30s. No credentials, no spotlight, just a viewer, a citizen. No one asked his name, but they listened. Jasmine broke the silence next. You said you took the blame for Diego's assault. You erased his name, but you still signed policies that hurt others like him. That doesn't cancel out. She wasn't angry. She was asking, for real. The camera, slow and steady, found Arnold in the shadows near stage left. He hadn't left the building. He was standing there, hands behind his back, half in frame, watching. John noticed. Governor, you're still here. Arnold didn't step forward. He didn't wave. He spoke, not to Jasmine, not to John, but to the whole room. I didn't come to cancel out anything. He let the line breathe before finishing. I came to find out if a room full of voices would hear something that wasn't theirs. That sentence didn't feel like a twist. It felt like a mirror, the kind that doesn't show your reflection, but your posture. Samara's voice trembled for the first time. What happens now? Arnold looked at the wooden box. He nodded once. That depends, he said, on whether you open that or leave it shut because it came from the wrong hands. Jasmine stood, not out of outrage, out of something slower, heavier. I'm tired of debates, she said. I'm tired of spinning stories into sides. Maybe it's not about who was right back then. Maybe it's about who's still trying to be right now. She walked over to the table. Her hand hovered above the box. Then she stopped. I won't open it. John raised an eyebrow. Why not? She looked at Arnold. Because if what he says is true, it was never ours to open. Arnold's eyes didn't shift. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, as if to say, finally, someone saw the shape of the silence. The producer whispered to John from offstage. Time was up. The feed would cut in 60 seconds. John turned to camera 3. We came here tonight to ask questions of the past. But I think the past asked something back. The final shot pulled wide. Jasmine returned to her seat. Samara watched the lights dim. Arnold remained still, unmoving, as if he'd become part of the architecture. The box stayed on the table, unopened, and yet, somehow, everything inside had already been revealed. The room dimmed, but the story didn't end. The feed was cut, but no one moved. Some of the audience stayed seated, phones still in hand. Not recording anymore, just holding them like they forgot why they ever pressed record in the first place. On stage, the lights cooled to a soft amber hue. The backdrop, once lit with titles and graphics, now faded into a neutral gray, as if the show no longer knew what it was about. Arnold hadn't stepped away. He remained near the edge of the platform, framed by nothing but silence. No handlers, no entourage, just a man standing as still as the idea he carried. For the first time all evening, there was no discussion about him. There was only the presence of him. John Stewart approached the wooden box like it might break the floor if disturbed. He stopped a few feet short and looked at Arnold. You said there was more than Diego's file inside. Arnold didn't nod. He didn't blink. He simply said, "Yes." John looked at Jasmine and Samara. Neither moved. This wasn't a decision anymore. John lowered his voice. "Can I see it?" Arnold didn't answer right away. Then he stepped forward, not far, not fast, just enough to enter the light again. He rested one hand on the lid of the box. The room held its breath. Then he said, "No." The answer landed with finality no one expected. Not a denial, not an evasion, a boundary. John straightened up. "Why not?" Arnold looked at him, and for a brief second, there was something behind his eyes, more than memory, less than anger. "Because what's inside isn't mine anymore," he said. "It belongs to those who were never invited to this stage." John looked down. Slowly, he took a step back. It wasn't about him. It never had been. Arnold turned to the audience, not to address them, just to see them. His gaze didn't scan for approval. It searched for something quieter, recognition. He said, "You came here thinking this was a conversation about leadership. It was never about that. It was about memory, about how we choose to carry it, or bury it." Jasmine stood, not in defiance now, but in stillness. "I judged you," she said. "I thought I knew what kind of man you were." Arnold met her eyes. "You were right. Just not completely." Samara added, "And we used Diego's story to frame you. We built a spotlight from someone else's struggle. We didn't ask if the story we were telling was ours to use." Arnold nodded once. "You told the version you were given. Most people do. That's how power stays clean." The room didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a church that had just been reminded why it was built. A young production assistant walked onto the stage quietly, holding a clipboard he no longer cared to look at. He whispered to John, who simply waved him off. The show had ended 30 minutes ago. This moment hadn't. Arnold stepped toward the table. He touched the box once, lightly, like it might not be solid after all, and then turned away. His voice, when it returned, didn't project. It remained low. "I didn't fund this show to be heard. I funded it to listen." John asked, "So what did you hear?" Arnold paused, then said, "That truth doesn't win. It waits." There was no follow-up, no retort, just that, a closing line without punctuation. He walked offstage without fanfare. No applause followed, no music played, only the sound of doors opening somewhere in the back, and then closing behind him like a breath held too long finally released. The camera, one last camera, panned back to the box. Still sealed, still untouched. It had never been about what was inside. It had always been about who was willing to carry the weight of it and never use it. Outside the studio, the night had folded itself into quiet. No reporters waited by the exit. No security ushered Arnold through a side door. He left the way he came, in silence, alone, through the front. A few stagehands saw him pass, unsure if they should speak. None of them did. He didn't ask for a car. He walked. Back inside, the crew stood around the set, not breaking it down yet. The box remained on the table, untouched, Not because it was sacred, but because no one wanted to be the first to make it ordinary again. For 30 minutes, it had become heavier than any headline, and now it just sat there, still, waiting for nothing. John sat slouched in his chair, tie loosened, face blank. His usual sharpness had dulled. Words were tools he had always trusted. But tonight, they hadn't landed, not where it counted. Jasmine lingered near the curtain, arms crossed not in defense, but in thought. She replayed every exchange. The sound of her own voice now felt louder than it had in the moment. She wondered who she had been talking to: Arnold, the audience, or a version of herself she no longer agreed with. Samara had disappeared backstage. She wasn't crying. She wasn't ashamed. But she wasn't ready to speak. What do you say when you realize the narrative you've been defending was real, but not complete? Back in the editing bay, a junior producer reviewed the footage, frame by frame, looking not for mistakes, but for the exact second the room had turned. It hadn't happened with a twist. It had happened with restraint. That was a power no one had anticipated, that a man could shift an entire conversation by choosing not to weaponize what he carried. And somewhere across the country, Diego Martinez sat in a modest apartment, watching the rerun play on mute. He had known none of this. No one had told him. His mother had passed 3 years earlier. She had taken the secret with her. He stared at the television as his name flashed across the screen, framed by words like survivor, hero, story of hope. He leaned forward slowly, then turned up the volume, just in time to hear Arnold say, "I replaced his name with mine." The words didn't hit like a surprise. They hit like something he had always suspected, but never allowed himself to believe. He sat back. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just breathed. Back at CNN, the room had mostly cleared. One stage tech approached the table, eyes on the box. He reached out, then paused. A note had been placed beside it. Handwritten, short. Not everything true needs to be published. No signature. No explanation. The tech didn't touch the box. He stepped away. Somewhere in the digital cloud, the episode had begun to spread, but not the way viral clips usually did. There were no cut downs, no meme captions, no spin. It passed quietly, almost like folklore. One Reddit thread called it the interview that ended without a winner. Another, the moment we forgot who the host was. A single YouTube re-upload surfaced, titled with nothing but the timestamp, 47:08. The moment Arnold said, he took the blame. No commentary, no edits, just raw playback. It gained 10,000 shares before anyone even realized it was trending. People didn't know what they felt watching it. That's why they kept watching it again. No one declared Arnold right. No one called Jasmine wrong. There was no podium to claim. Only the weight of a man who had carried something longer than anyone knew, and chose to walk away without dropping it on someone else. At a high school in Sacramento, a civics teacher played the clip without warning, paused it halfway, and wrote one question on the board: what does power look like when it refuses to use itself? The students didn't answer, not immediately, because somewhere in their silence, they realized they had seen the answer already. It wore no title. It needed no defense. It had a name, yes, but it left that name off the box. The next morning, there were no headlines, no network banner, no op-ed screaming for justice or redemption. The story didn't break. It seeped, slowly, like light through a window that had been painted shut for years. Something had shifted, but not loud enough to trend. It moved differently, like memory, like guilt, like reverence. Arnold didn't issue a statement. His office made no calls. He went for a walk at sunrise alone, along a trail overlooking Los Angeles. The city didn't know what had happened yet. Not really, but some people did. And for them, something had quietly rewired. Inside a newsroom across town, a junior journalist drafted a piece she wouldn't publish. Not because it wasn't true, but because she didn't know how to finish it. The working title read, "The Man Who Gave the Mic Back to the Room." She deleted it, then rewrote it with a single line. "We saw what silence looks like when it still carries a name." On Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett sat in her office with the blinds half open. The sunlight carved slow lines across the floor. She hadn't planned to speak about what happened. But by noon, a staffer asked if she wanted to release a follow up. She shook her head, then paused. Write something, she said, but don't offend me. What should it say? She answered quietly. Just say I saw something that made me reconsider the way I listen. Elsewhere, Diego Martinez walked into the clinic where he worked 30 minutes early for the first time in months. He said nothing to his coworkers, but he carried a folded sheet of paper in his back pocket. On it was a screen grab, a still frame from the broadcast. The moment Arnold said his name, not as a warning, not as a weapon, but as a memory, he didn't show it to anyone. He just kept it close, like proof of something he hadn't asked for but couldn't return. Back at CNN headquarters, the wooden box had been moved, not thrown away, not sealed in archives, just placed gently in a private room. No label, no key, only a note taped to the glass door. This belongs to no one. That's why it matters. Viewers who had seen the full episode once began watching again, not to find what they missed, but to re-feel the moment it changed. Some tried to explain it online, calling it restraint or reverse power or moral clarity. But none of those words held long. The people who truly understood didn't try to name it. They just carried it. A high school teacher in Baltimore printed out a quote from the transcript and pinned it above the chalkboard. It read, I didn't come to cancel out anything. I came to find out if a room full of voices would hear something that wasn't theirs. Below it, a handwritten note in pencil. Don't just speak. Don't just hear. Listen. That evening, a podcast host on the opposite end of the political spectrum opened his monologue differently. No music, no outrage, just stillness. I think last night, for once, he said, the camera didn't capture performance. It captured a choice. There were no debates following that episode. No one shouted in prime time. The story was too quiet to be monetized, too complicated to be clipped. But in small corners, at dinner tables, in classrooms, in message threads that didn't go viral, people spoke differently. Not louder, just less certain. And somewhere in a modest home surrounded by silence, Arnold sat by a window with no television on, no script in hand, just a photo in his palm. Not of Diego, of someone else. Someone from another time, another riot, another silence he once carried. He didn't frame it. He didn't post it. He just remembered, because some stories aren't told to be shared. Some are lived to be left behind, exactly where they were needed